here's some updates on, I would say, a Bondi, which I would say, if you watch, I would say, last new or the previous videos ago, that Bondi, I would say, no longer be Attorney General. But I would say for these are updates as well, which I would say, according to a U.S. Department of Justice, which I would say, saying that Palm Bondi will not appear for a Epstein deposition because because they said she was no longer Attorney General anymore. Which I would say, according to according to Department of Justice, I would say, which is said on Wednesday that I would say will not appear. I would say on next upcoming deposition for a House Overnight Committee for a Jeffrey Epstein investigation, that I would say she was given that she was no longer serving as an U.S. Attorney General. But I would say, which on these ones, it will mark as I would say, a roadblock for Congress, I would say, to fight and also carry Bondi's, I would say, Palm Bondi's sworn testimony, which I would say, which he also related, I would say, on the Justice Department on public release, which also have a many, I would say, investigative files, which I would say, according to Jeffrey Epstein, which I would say he was convicted as a sex offender as well. Also, however, I would say the U.S. Department of Justice, I would say, was argued that I would say Bondi, which I would say was a subordinate, I would say, of her role, I would say, as an attorney. However, I would say it was not in her capacity. However, for example, she won't appear on a Capitol Hill on a April 14th, which I would say to discuss, I would say, her role, which I would say overseeing on the Epstein's file, that I would say the U.S. Attorney General, which Palm Bondi, I would say can choose to release the files as well. And also for releasing out Epstein file, which for these also Assistant Attorney General Patrick D. Davids also wrote a letter to a House Oversight Chairman, also which I would say James Corner, or a House Oversight Chairman. However, if you look it back, I would say, if you look at, for example, representative, I would say Nancy Mace, or I would say RSC, which I would say who forced the committee to vote, I would say subpoena Bondi. However, I would say she argued that her subpoena, I would say, is still valid because I would say they request a Bondi testimony by name, but I would say, however, not by title anyway. But if we look into a Democrat, I would say, if we look into a Democrats on the committee, however, I would say Democrats committee, I would say stand firm on a Bondi, which I would say legally 65, I would say, which no, I would say regardless of her current title. However, if Bondi doesn't appear on a April 14th disposition, a oversight ranking, I would say ranking member, which I'll say Robert Garcia, which is Democrat from California, which I would say, which is they will threaten to pursue a contempt of Congress, I would say, to charge against Bondi as well. Also, Representative Kokana, which also from Democrat from California, which also wrote a letter to a Comer, last Thursday, on the earlier Thursday. These are on earlier Wednesday on this week as well. I would say saying that he publicly reaffirmed that Bondi must appear of her April 14th disposition, which they also wrote a date or threatened to a appropriate enforcement. They also noted that if she doesn't comply with these, the lawmakers, I would say, if she doesn't comply, and also lawmakers will argue that Bondi's testimonies is even more important, I would say, in a light for her. But lastly, I would say, according to these statements, I would say from a DOJ, and also from the DOJ, and also from the official, saying that the removal of Palm Bondi as the Attorney General does not diminish of the committee's legitimate oversight interest in seeking her sworn testimony, or the need for a accountability and information about the files withheld from the public by the DOJ or a U.S. Department of Justice. Also, Kiana, and also Mays will be stipend to St. Comer. They also ending with on contrary, it makes her sworn testimony even more important, especially with respect to actions that she took as an Attorney General matters already under investigation. Decision was made under her leadership as well. I would say, and these for the updates for the Palm Bondi and also Jeffrey Epstein, which I would say Palm Bondi was fired from a US DOJ. And that's it for the update for this news as well.